Welcome to Centropolis, our ongoing conversation about books, ideas, and characters in the drama of our city and times. I'm your host, Crosby Kemper, the director of the Kansas City Public Library. Our guest today is Whitney Terrell. I sometimes call him Kansas City's greatest living novelist, which he hates because in addition to writing 3 spectacular, good, gripping novels, including his latest, The Good Lieutenant, he has also helped UMKC develop a fine writers program, including some other really fine writers. And like a good captain, Whitney wants to celebrate the whole company. But today, I want to celebrate Whitney. So Whitney, I want to get to The Good Lieutenant in a little bit. It's just come out to excellent reviews, including one in the New York Times. It's a taut and explosive novel. But I want to talk a little bit about your first 2 novels, The Huntsman, a New York Times notable book, and The King of Kings County. They're both historical novels, in a sense, about the founding of Kansas City, in a way, the foundations of Kansas City, kind of mythical foundations of Kansas City. So is that what they're all about? Is it about the founding of Kansas City, the moral founding, if you will, of Kansas City? What are those themes?
Yeah, I mean, I guess you could say that. The Huntsman is a historical novel just because my art editor would say it took me so long to write them that they become historical novels
Right.
by the time I'm done.
A big part of your history, that's for sure.
But the very first book, The Huntsman, I wrote because I had been studying with a guy named James Allen McPherson, who just recently passed away.
Died, yeah.
And I wrote a small memorial for him for Literary Hub. But Jim was a really important writer. He's African-American novelist. And
a huge influence on lots of other writers.
Short story writer, not a novelist.
Yeah. But a huge influence on other writers, not just
other
you.
writers.
When he died, there were lots of encomia about him.
He taught at Iowa for a long time. And he had always said race is a really important American subject, and you all should write about it, whatever your race may be in this class. And so Kansas City opened up to me as a place to write about when I started to think about it in terms of more than just my background, Yeah,
and the books are about race and class.
Yeah, sure.
And you and I grew up in class terms, kind of in the, I'm 17 years older than you are, but in the same neighborhood and going to the same school.
Yeah.
And
it's very scary.
Yeah, very, very scary. In other words, you could end up like me. It occurs to me that there's an interesting dichotomy in your work between the very fine-grained look at the way people interact socially and your incredible descriptions of the detail of life, including the mechanical details in The Good Lieutenant, including the landscape of Kansas City and the social landscape of Kansas City. But at the same time, there's a lot of melodrama in these books. There's murder and incest, interracial engagements at a time when those are melodramatic, trials, balls and country club culture.
It's called plot.
Plot, excellent. Well, and they are really, really gripping. Do you see the social circle that you describe so finely in both the books as being a limiting or a liberating a factor in your writing?
You mean for me personally, the social circle that I sort of came
because
out of?
in the first book, in The Huntsman, you in particular, you reach out and you describe a world that obviously is not your world.
Yeah.
A world of African Americans in Oklahoma and coming to Kansas City, a very, very different world, but also the world that you grew up in, or
well, I mean, I wanted to. I think the world that I grew up in was interesting in its relationship to other worlds, right? And I care about that world, but I felt like, look, middle class and upper middle class white life has been very happily described by a number of writers that came before me, and it was pretty clear to me by the time my career was starting that I wasn't just going to be able to use the material immediately at hand, like somebody like John Updike did or John Cheever. And that was a problem at first, but thanks to McPherson, and other really amazing American writers, I feel like writing around and using that life that I grew up in as a part of the canvas that you're writing about makes it more interesting. In other words, going to the Jewel Ball, which is a big debutante ball in Kansas City that we both are familiar with.
The Founders Ball.
The Founders Ball in Huntsman is much more interesting when you look at it from Booker Short's point of view, who's the main character and protagonist of the Huntsman, and he's African American and he's from Oklahoma.
Yeah.
Seeing that ball from his point of view is interesting to me and different than just looking at it from somebody like me.
Right. And he's a very dramatic character. And, one question I have about the novel, reading for the second time, is I noticed, I thought about his name, Booker Short, or as I'm calling him, Booker Shorter now. There's a relationship, I think, I want to ask you, though, to Bigger Thomas from Native Son. Was that anywhere in your mind when you were writing about him? There's a crime, an important crime.
Yeah.
Looks like he might have murdered somebody.
I feel like Richard Wright's a very important writer and somebody that I admire and certainly read. I do feel like there's a difference between Booker Short and Bigger Thomas in the sense that I feel like Booker Short is a more Ellisonian character. Ellison sort of believed that it was possible, you were aware of racism and structural racism, which is a fact in Kansas City, but the individual can attempt to transcend and can at times transcend those circumstances. I think that's something that Ellison believed that maybe Richard Wright in Bigger felt like he was doomed to be this failed person.
He's controlled by his environment.
Right. I don't feel like that is the case for.
Well, and you end the book in a way that's clear that's not the case.
Yeah.
That he does liberate himself to some extent. From
So I
his
feel
environment.
like Ralph Ellison and Richard Wright sort of separated on that issue, and I sort of am more down the Ellison path.
And literary influences on your work. You write about the same milieu that Evan Cannell writes about. I mean, they're a few blocks away from each other.
No, that's true. That's definitely true.
Literally
My aunt grew up on his street.
Right, and I knew his stepmother very well. And you kind of explode that world. He minutely describes it. I mean, I think Mrs. Bridge is one of the great novels.
Yeah, those are tremendous books.
Did they have any influence on you? I mean, did you think about them at all while you were writing either the Huntsman or King of Kings County?
I didn't think about them as so much as knowing that I needed to do something different and that there was plenty of room to do something different. I mean, I feel like those books had an incredibly powerful hold on the way people thought about what Kansas City was and who the people were in Kansas City. And that's to the credit of the books, But my aunt used to say about Evan S. Cannell's mom in relation to Mrs. Bridge, she's like, well, she was that way. That's just how she was. Meaning not all of us were that way. But that's not really true. I mean, it was a really good portrait of what a social class was like, and you can recognize people like that to this day.
And that is something that, again, my different view of the world, a little bit different view of the world than yours. I do read both books, and I think they're great novels, and I do think the plot is great. Your plotting is always great. It's gripping. You want to know what happens next is really important. But I always feel the same way. That I know these characters. Some of the characters are very recognizable, and in fact, some of them are drawn directly from real life.
Perhaps too recognizable.
Yeah, they're very recognizable to you and to me.
Call my lawyers.
You're right, exactly. But I think they are individual, and there are other parts of the truth, and maybe there's a different way of looking at it, Cannell's way, or there could be a third way entirely.
For me, I always thought about the city more than thinking about it like Cannell. I thought of Kansas City in terms of William Faulkner, who was perhaps the most influential writer for me. And Faulkner wrote about a city that knew each other where the families and people knew each other generationally over time, where he wrote about both white and black characters. Right. He wrote about Native American characters. He wrote about everyone who was there.
Right.
And he wrote about the city in a 360-degree way. And that's what I wanted to do when I set out writing The Huntsman and then The King of Kings
The
County.
Huntsman in particular has a Yoknebatafa kind
There's
of
no
feel,
doubt for me
feel-
it's very
feel to it.
important.
It's a little different than my view. Another literary influence that I see on you, and he was one of your teachers, and you acknowledge him, at least one of your acknowledgments. I'm talking about John McPhee.
Oh, yeah.
James Wood, in a literary commentary, talks about Chekhov, and he says, like all great novelists, he's a serious noticer. And I think that's true of John McPhee, and I think that's true of your descriptions of landscape, your description of tools and mechanical things.
Yeah.
You're a serious noticer.
You could argue that all these social issues that we're talking about and the characters are just excuses for me to get to write about processes that I find very interesting. I find real estate to be a very interesting process. I like to describe, what it's like to go look up a deed in the county court office, or what it's like to go duck hunting and how the fields work, or what it's like to, drive a Hercules recovery vehicle in Iraq. I mean, those processes, and that interest came out of studying with John, but it was there with me before I ever met him. As far as landscape goes, my great-grandfather and grandfather were painters, and my uncle on my mom's side, there was a whole generation, several generations of painters. My great-grandfather, that was his profession. He was a portrait painter in Kansas City at a time when you could still sort of make a living at that. He did not make a very good living at it. Thinking about landscape and place came to me through the art side of my family.
And of course, in King of Kings County, the book is very ostensibly about real estate.
Yeah.
And it's really a roman à clef about J.C. Nichols, I think we could say.
Yeah, sure. It's a sort of myth of Kansas City. I mean, in other words, I wrote this book, The Huntsman, that was about racial separation in Kansas City, bringing an African-American young man up to Kansas City to find this white captain who had fought with his grandfather in World War II. I mean, that's the plot, right? And the key to the novel is that the white grandfather, Mercury Chapman, knew that Booker's grandfather hated him and that they'd had a huge argument during the war, and this has been buried. And so the working out,
another
working out of that buried secret is part of what the novel's about. But it also was an opportunity to inject an African-American character like Booker into Mercury's world, which is pretty white. And I was thinking about, well, why is the city so segregated? And also, why was downtown, which my grandparents used to talk to me about all the time as being so incredibly exciting and having, a fabulous library, or having having the Union Station be great, and going down to Union Station and having lunch and all these things that you used to be able to do down there, going to the Aztec room.
The Fred Harvey room,
yeah,
which my father used to take me to.
I heard all these stories as a kid, and then for me, I'd go down there and just be crickets chirping, empty buildings. Now it's different today, but in my growing up, the downtown was dead, and Johnson County was growing at this incredibly rapid pace. Yeah. And I was looking for explanations for that.
Right. And so it's white flight from the schools in decay, and from black people. You talk in the book about the Bowen Company, which is the substitute for the Nichols Company, owning basically the city, the controlling environment, a little bit like Native Son we were talking about before, which I don't really see as being true, because I think there was black flight as well as white flight. If you go out south along the Holmes-Warnell corridor, you get integrated neighborhoods where the black middle class left the school district and the decay of downtown and whatnot. There are a lot of different reasons for that. But the other influence I want to ask you about, because I'm interested in this, is books you read as a child, or books that you tell your students to read. What are the great books of imagination that stirred you to be a novelist or a storyteller?
Like as a child.
As a child or a teenager, maybe. Were there books that were really important to you, something that liberated your imagination?
That's really interesting. The books that I remember most clearly reading are C.S. Lewis's The Chronicles of Narnia, and I read all of those, not just The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And those are really well-made books. I remember reading Watership Down. That was an important book for me. I remember reading The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Those weren't as influential for me for whatever reason.
Right.
But I also remember reading, and we still have this huge shelf full of these historical landmark series.
The landmark books. I love the landmark
Those
books when I
things
was a
were
kid.
awesome. You know, reading
Betsy
about the
Ross
Marquis de Lafayette or whatever. I
Lafayette,
loved that
yeah.
stuff.
The Wright brothers, I remember reading.
So those
about.
kind of things, reading about facts and history was maybe more important to me than you would expect for a fiction writer.
That's really interesting, because I see this in your work. Fantasy. You're reading a lot of fantasy, and you talk more than once. I think in each of the novel there are important passages about dreams.
Yeah.
And then you are a very hard, serious noticer of the facts of life, including the hardest facts of race and class, sex and violence. There's lots of sex and violence.
Yeah, keep mentioning that.
Just so you know.
Yeah.
So do you feel that pull between the dream and the reality, the fantasy and the hard fact?
Well, reality is what makes you have dreams. You know, that's why we create fiction, is to, first of all, try to understand our reality, and then to enhance it or change it in the ways that we feel best express the way we feel about that reality.
Well, all the novels, including the Good Lieutenant, which we should talk about a little bit, are novels about things that are wrong in the world, or wrong in the world of the individuals, wrong in the world of the city or the army, the nation. In the case of the Good Lieutenant, and do you expect? Do you write fiction at all to change people's minds or encourage people to be better or do better?
Especially not that, yeah. I think. I think that I start, the character in, the main character in The Speaker in The King of Kings County is Jack Atchison, who is sort of horrified by his father's sort of manipulations of the real estate market, Alton Atchison, who's an invented character. And Jack is kind of prudish and kind of like, you know, and when you read the book, you like Alton, I think, even though Alton is the sort of guy who breaks all the rules.
He's a big character.
But he admits, look, American business is about breaking the rules. Look at Tom Durant. Look how he built the railroad across Iowa and made it curve so that it would go by the land that he owned. You know, he says, look, and he embraces the contradictory messiness of the American dream and the American business. Whereas Jack is the moralist. The writer can't be Jack.
Right.
Right? The writer may have a part of him that is Jack, the moralist, right? But when you start writing the book, you've got to be Alton. You've got to embrace every character in the book and find ways to argue for positions that you might find morally repugnant.
Yeah,
right?
in the Huntsman, both the judge and the judge actually in many ways is the most interesting character.
And he's a bad dude.
And he's a very very.
But it's
very
also
bad
axiomatic of fiction that good characters are boring and flawed, and hurt characters are the most interesting. The readers want those characters, and the reason is that we all sit around being polite to each other all day long. We're Midwesterners after all, right? We've been taught how to do this. And that's why novels exist, because readers understand, look, there is a world in my brain that is not me being polite to you.
Yeah.
And I want to know, when I read a book, I want to access that world.
Well,
you know?
we all, it's a good Protestant view of the world that we all share an original sin.
Yeah.
And it's going to come out at some point. So a good way maybe to shift to The Good Lieutenant, which is a very different book than your first two books. It takes place partly in Fort Riley, so there is some connection to our part of the world.
Yeah.
But mostly in Iraq.
Yeah.
And mostly in Iraq during a very violent time.
Mm-hmm.
Things like IEDs are very big in the novel. And you were embedded in Iraq. And,
Yeah.
and how long were you embedded, and what kind of a unit were you with?
I was there with, the first time with an infantry battalion, the 122, 1st Battalion, 22nd Infantry. And that was both times pretty short embeds, like 2 weeks in the summer of 2006, and then again in 2010 with a 36th Engineer Brigade, again for about that same amount of time. But 2006 is really when the novel is set. And that was a really difficult time in Iraq. There had been a bombing of important Shia shrine, this mosque with a golden dome in Samarra in February. And that had really set off a civil war in the countryside. And the army, I mean, maybe at some particular level they knew exactly what was going on, but the guys I was with weren't sure, right? They were finding dead bodies in open fields. They would do a foot patrol through a village and suddenly there'd be no people there. They were trying to piece together this violence that was happening in the countryside that they weren't sure what the cause was.
It took you a long time to write the novel. So it's set in 2006, and you were back in 2011, I think. Is that right? Around that time?
2010.
2010, when it changed a lot. The U.S. was starting to withdraw.
Much better.
The government was pretty stable. The military situation was pretty stable, et cetera. Why did it take you so long to write the novel?
Because I screwed it up a whole bunch of times. I, made a lot of mistakes, and also I think that I was nervous about writing about a war. I wanted to do a good job. I wanted to have researched it properly. So this is kind of perfect storm of things, and I think it helped to go a second time and sort of see all those places again. I wrote the book in chronological order. It didn't work so good that way.
Right.
It was boring, as we were talking about good characters and nice characters being a problem. My character, Lieutenant Emma Fowler, who's the protagonist, she goes on an arc through the book from being a person, family values Fowler, this real rule-oriented, perfectly, follow the rules lieutenant, to somebody who's much more complicated. And so the early parts of her, when I was writing them, I was like, this doesn't work. I don't like her that much. And it wasn't until I reversed the order of the novel and started with the ending, made her a much more flawed character, or what you meet her at first, she is a much more flawed, complicated person. She's also much more interesting. And then as the book moves backward away from this opening scene, which is an IED attack in which several of her soldiers are killed, you begin to watch her return to innocence. And that is more complicated than doing it in the sort of forward way.
I think it's a brilliant conceit because it instead of subtracting layers to her, it actually adds layers to her that way, and to the understanding of the relationship. In some ways, it's interesting. In some ways, though the novels are all the novels have plot points about the development of some business going on, some activity going on. The war, of course, the platoon in the war. In the Huntsman, it's this club and a death and a trial, et cetera. But they're love stories too. And one of the great things about the Good Lieutenant is the development of understanding of this love story as you go back.
Yeah.
You don't understand it at the beginning, and you do understand it by the end, even though you're going back in time.
Thank you.
Not forward.
Speaking of things that I screwed up in the book, those two characters were originally brother and sister for 5 or 6 years.
Incest is prominent in The Huntsman. I guess you could make
it would not have worked that way. I had to make them lovers, and I didn't figure that out for a long time.
The theme, One question I want to ask you about is about your argument with Ernest Hemingway.
Do I have an argument with Ernest Hemingway? You have an argument with Ernest Hemingway
because Hemingway famously, in a story called God Rest You Merry Gentlemen, said Kansas City is a lot like Constantinople. And in The Huntsman, you have a great passage that I think in some ways summarizes your view of the world.
I know what part you're going to read.
Yeah,
that's good.
I think it's the judge talking. Of course, you know that none of this is going to matter to any of them, not even if you told them about the bad things that he's done, the terrible things that he's done. It doesn't fit into the dream. It's the dream again. I don't believe the city is a dream, says the detective. He says, is this Paris, Athens, Rome, Constantinople before the Crusades? So he's saying Kansas City's not Constantinople. He said, We're not so, in fact, obscure as savages. And having had the dream for so long, we find it easy, don't we, not to see the things that do not fit. In a way, your fiction is about taking your characters' dreams and saying they don't fit.
That's true.
And exposing the reality behind the dream of Atchison, J.C. Nichols' character, or the judge and the members of the club.
I think there are different ways to use the word dream, right? You can use the word dream to mean illusion, and you can use the word dream to mean a thing that I hope for or wish in the future, right? One has a more positive connotation than the other. I would say that you usually start a novel with certain characters believing in a certain illusion, and the book is about them learning what's true and what isn't true about that illusion or dream that they have about the world that they live in. Any dramatic arc involves that process, right? So it's a natural thing.
Great. Well, thank you. Whitney, your novels do connect us in our little platoon to the dreams and the truth about our city and the world, as far apart as those dreams and the truth frequently are. And knowing that inches us maybe a little closer to the dream. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.